I'm Sari Cooper, a certified sex therapist and sex coach in New York City. I'll be your host to Sex Esteem, a new show where we will explore in all its expressions relationships and sex in the modern world. Tune in for fun-filled facts and entertaining tips to having a more pleasurable sex life. Welcome, everyone, to another interview with an incredible author. This is Sex Esteem with Sari Cooper. And today I have the honor of interviewing Lisa Phillips. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Lisa. Lisa A. Phillips is the author of Unrequited, The Thinking Women's Guide to Romantic Obsession and Public Radio Behind the Voices. She's written about relationships, mental health, and teens for the New York Times, Washington Post, Psych Today, Cosmopolitan, Salon, and many other outlets. She teaches journalism and the popular Love and Heartbreak seminar at the State University of New York at New Paltz, and she lives in Woodstock, New York. In her it's her new book, First Love, Guiding Teens Through Relationships and Heartbreak, Lisa Phillips chronicles the challenges today's adolescents face as they navigate crushes, dating, and breakups, and also the challenges that adults face as they strive to provide guidance and support. And it's told from the perspective of a professor, obviously, a mother, and an award-winning journalist. So First Love is a critical resource for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and others who want to understand the new realities of teen relationships and help teens become caring, self-aware, and thriving young adults. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, I've been able to read some of it ahead of publication, which is coming out in February. Do you have a date?
February 4th, 10 days before Valentine's Day.
Perfect timing. And I guess I wanted to start with, in one of the earlier chapters or in the intro, you talk about your own experience as a mother and when your daughter first kind of crushed on somebody. Um, and she used the language, I'm so gone. And that really was profound to me. So the other part of that expression was you described your feelings as a parent, as a mother, as also feeling like your daughter was so gone from you as an attachment figure. So are we concerned about, in your case, your daughter and obviously teens, but I would also say as a therapist and a sex therapist, feeling like when clients or kids are so gone from their own core sense of self.
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you. And thanks for having me. So I think that the so gone from a parent is what teens do. It's what they do in terms of connecting with peers. It's what they're doing emotionally. They are separating from us. That is what we're raising them to do, even though it's really painful sometimes for parents to watch the kid who, in my daughter's case, she was still holding my hand in public spaces when she was 12. And then like the minute she turned 13, bye, mom, and I was lucky if I got a hug once a month. So this is just what they do. So that's a kind of so gone that entering a first relationship can really, make more pointed, right? So not only do they not want to hug you, there's someone else they want to hug and, of course, do more with. And that, again, is very developmentally appropriate. Like they're supposed to be having they're developing sexually, they're developing emotionally, and they essentially are supposed to be on a journey of finding new attachment figures to replace us with, not as their new mother or father, obviously, but as their peer main attachment figure. This is what we do as human beings. It is how the species perpetuates itself, and it is how we all have the promise of living healthy relationship lives. This is part of what keeps us healthy. Um, the so gone, as you're pointing out, can have this other element, which is the so gone from themselves, which is something that relationships can do to many of us, all of us throughout our lives, where something strikes hard and suddenly we are different people and not always in healthy ways. Sometimes new relationships, even when the participants are young, can be very expansive and make, as one of the people I interviewed described it to me, make people feel like more of themselves, like they are more engaged with the world, that their interests are expanding, that this new person is genuinely exciting and exposing them to new ways of looking at the world. That's a beautiful thing that happens in human relationships. But then sometimes it's like, okay, what cult did my kid join? And this can't be healthy because everything is about the other person, and the enmeshment of the relationship. And that, of course, can be cause for concern, especially when you feel, and sometimes if you can engage your child about this, sometimes even they feel less of themselves, like less of themselves. And in that way, they are gone from critical parts of who they are. And that can be a very hard thing to interfere with because it's enmeshed with their feelings of love and desire and concern about the other person, but is absolutely something that if you have some language for it, like literally those terms, do you feel like more of yourself? Do you feel like less of yourself? That can be a real awakening for a young person to be like, wait, I feel like less of myself. I don't feel as right in the world. It's all about this person. And it can bring them, they might not necessarily be like, hey, mom, you just made me see the truth of this situation. This dude is gone. It may not happen that way, but you know how young people are. They hear you. They hear you, even if they don't always let on that they hear you. So this is one of the ways that parents can offer ideas and language to help them assess how gone are they and is it healthy gone? And if it's not healthy gone, what might they want to be thinking about to change that?
Yeah. I think it's great. Because you're talking also about what we call in psychology, as you know, as individuation, right? It is a
Mhm.
normative part of development for children, teens, young adults to test out what it is they want in terms of values, priorities, lifestyle from the way they grew up with their parents and family of origin to what they want to be as their own identity, right? And so, for those of you who don't know this, though, individuation is actually kind of the first wave of what a healthy relationship down the line will do in what we call differentiation. And a lot of, couples therapists, sex therapists like myself, we actually address this all the time because we get a lot of couples, partners who come in who have not actually mastered differentiation. So,
Interesting.
I think what's wonderful about this book is it is helping parents consider how they individuate is an important process for later down the line. How they date, how they connect with their first initial romantic partners is so important because I guess I just want to talk to you about that piece because you interviewed, how many people did you interview? How many teens did you interview?
So it's a little hard to get an exact number because there are the people I interviewed on Zoom and they're the people I corresponded with and all there's sort of different ways of interviewing and connecting. But overall, if I'm going to include the teens and the parents I talked to, it was more than 100 people. Yeah. And I don't do this to get a scientific survey. I did this to really get a lot of color and context and a sense of where everybody's concerns were.
Mm,
And then, of course, to get the voices into the stories and the situations into the book.
yeah. So, I think there's something, and I don't know because I haven't read the whole book, but I don't know if you've like quoted, Helen Fisher,
Oh,
who's the
sure, yeah.
renowned, anthropologist who passed away last year, who really talks about, and her last book, which I think is still going to come out, is about the addiction. She compares infatuation, or the period that sex therapists called the stage of limerence, which is that first 12 months to 2 years of a relationship where you're passionately in love with somebody, compared it to sort of the brain scans of people who are addicted to a substance. So I guess my question for you is, what would you say to parents about how to prepare yourself? We won't even get to the talk yet about sex, but how to prepare kids for understanding what will happen to them when they initially fall in love?
Mm. I think that there are different ways and stages to do it, right? So young people will be exposed to representations of romance, desire, and love from a very early age. I mean, this is in Disney movies, right? So you can actually start those discussions really early. And I definitely did with my daughter. We had a ongoing joke about Snow White, like the foolish things she did. Like, why is she opening the door for strangers? And just overall, whenever we saw a representation of love on screen, we would engage about it. And so that is one way to start to introduce that idea. But I actually think very little can prepare you for that mind-seizing feeling of um, addiction to another person, of really craving and longing for another person. And I think it can be very unsettling for young people. And I think that they can experience their own sense of loss of self. I know I have very strong memories of being a teenager and thinking like, oh, I really used to just lose myself in a book. And now there are these boys in my head. And I remember feeling like, oh, I don't know if I like this so much. I'm not myself anymore. And so I think just to have the conversation start early and include these ideas of addiction, of how much real estate in their brain these
Mhm.
things can take up with people. And then when it happens, it will still feel strange, but hopefully a dialogue will be ongoing about it so that you can engage. And I also think it helps so much to not only talk about addiction. I mean, addiction, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? Because it gives you a great understanding into how intense these feelings are. And that's very positive. But teens can be like very tough on themselves, I found, especially in my class, about this idea of addiction. Addiction is bad. So if I'm feeling it in a relationship, that is bad. And I have to fight it. Or if I'm feeling it in a crush, even worse. Or if I'm feeling it in a situationship, even worse, because I should have known. He never said, or she never said it was going to be anything other than this. And so they can get like really hard on themselves, like about this idea of addiction. What I talk to my students about a lot is that this is a force that can be very disorienting and very intense, and it can lead to wonderful things. As Helen Fisher says, it's a great addiction when it's going well and a horrible addiction when it's going badly. But it ties us to something that is so fundamental to being human. If we didn't have these feelings, we would not open the door to lasting, loving romantic relationships that can improve, if they're going well, our overall well-being, our longevity, the state of our hearts, literally, all of those things. So this is part of what our brains and bodies do to prime us for the potential for that experience. So in that way, it can be very redeeming for young people to hear this. That's not just because I can't control myself that I feel this way. It is part of the life force of being a human being.
Mm. Well, I think most parents are one of their concerns, and we'll get to more details in a minute in it down the line, but one of the things that they're most concerned about is that their kid becomes so swept away that they will ignore all the other responsibilities and social connections that they have already. And so, and actually, I think, teens recognize this when it's happening to one of their friends. Um,
Hmm.
so I remember actually when I was in social work school, many, many years ago, and we were learning about addiction, actually substance to a substance. And our teacher, our professor said, if you haven't already experienced an addiction, like consciously to an illegal substance, or, find something that you think you're actually addicted to now and go for 30 days without doing it or eating it or consuming it, and journal about it and see what comes up for you. And how do you manage balancing that? And so I think what I chose was sugar, because I am addicted to sugar, white sugar, as many people are. And so I actually think a way of helping kids is by saying, here's what addiction is like. Let's do a like a kind of a simulated test of like, what do you give up when when you're on it, and what do you have to do in order to balance it? And
That's really good.
right, like,
Like eat
oh,
some bananas because
yeah,
bananas are
yeah,
sweet.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
But that sounds like a great thing to do.
so you were talking in the book also about kind of how things are a little different, right? And that I've written about this too in terms of the research of Gen Z, in terms of having sex, actually. So the research shows that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is the generation following them, hold off on having sex during high school compared to the boomer generation. And so 1991, 54% of high schoolers had stated that they had had sex, whereas by 2019 it was 38%, and in 2021 it had gone down to 30%. So you've offered some theories about why you think younger people are more tentative towards emotional intimacy. So can we talk about what young people at times are avoiding, namely catching feelings?
Yeah, yeah, we can talk about that. I think this trend is really fascinating. And I have to say for me, it's disturbing. I mean, it's very easy to just be like, okay, we don't have to worry as much about pregnancy. We don't have to worry as much about all kinds of other things, STIs,
Right.
dating abuse. There's a lot of dangers around the things that we do to become adults, having sex, driving cars, trying alcohol, all of those things, even being in the workforce, right? All these things, you're less safe theoretically than when you're at home alone in your room. But it also means that young people are entering their adult lives expecting the control of being alone in their rooms, choosing exactly what to watch, how to engage themselves online, which video game to play, etc. And that means less of an openness toward our fellow human being and deeper, more satisfying relationships there. So you asked about what they fear and what they're worried about in terms of situationships. I think that along with the delaying of the beginning of teen romantic life, sometimes well into adulthood, well into 20s, we have the accompanying situation that the relationships that are happening are less defined than they were when you and I were teens. So for example, if I in high school was hanging out with someone and watching a movie or whatever, and we started kissing, there would be this assumption that we were gonna date, right? And sure, people still hooked up and didn't do anything with it then too, but it was much more likely to be seen as part of a narrative of, okay, you're interested in each other and you're gonna try this thing out. Um, and now there's this whole spectrum of relationship experiences from talking, which is a kind of flirty, sexually charged back and forth over some kind of messaging or social media platform, to friends with benefits, to hooking up, to there's something, but we haven't defined it yet. So there are all these things that can happen. So parents will be like, okay, this person has been over cuddling with my kid for the past 10 weekends, but my kid says, no, we're not together. That person isn't my boyfriend or isn't my girlfriend. And the parents are going, what? You know? So there's this way in which there's an embrace. I don't even know if embrace is the right word, but there's a real sort of ethos of ambiguity and ambivalence that goes along with that. And I think there are some things that can be positive about that. You know, you don't always have to go right into a relationship. And certainly young people, just like all of us, have a right to have other priorities other than to say, this is the relationship, I'm in a relationship. But at the same time, situationships, which are the unnameable kinds of relationships, can be really tormenting for young people because um, they are worried about calling the shot and being like, okay, what are we? Because they're worried about rejection. And that situation can create a lot of anxiety. It can create a lot of kind of, I'll take what I can get situations. And young people put a lot of pressure on themselves to like be tough and hold up and be like, I can do this thing. I don't have to have a relationship. When I think what I preach in my book and in my classes is that, okay, choose what kind of relationship you want, but don't tell yourself that it is not a relationship. Any human connection is a relationship. So being carefree about it, as one author wrote, is very different from being careless. So ambiguously defined relationships should not be an excuse to hurt people. It should not be an excuse to disrespect people, any of those things. You still want to walk through the world as a caring and ethical human being, especially with your sexual and romantic self. So this is just something that can really, really torment young people and confuse adults. Though I think adults, especially if they're single, often are also dealing with this in their own lives, in their own dating lives to trying effect.
Right. Well, I think the other part of it is that what I see is in my Center for Love and Sex, we see a lot of young adults, 25 to 31, I would say, and they're coming in with their first kind, I would say, primary love person.
Mm,
It's like the first time, or maybe second time, that they have had a relationship where emotion, love, and sexuality are integrated. And what I have found, since I've been a certified sex therapist for now 16 years and practice for almost 30 years, is that, and I think the difference in generations is that they haven't had as much practice with integrating sexuality and emotional feeling because they're doing either more casual sexual things and trying to resist catching feelings. But I love the fact that you're saying every relationship is a relationship.
yeah,
And so that's, I think, a really important point. And I also think that one thing that parents can do is prepare them to ask themselves first, what is it that you want in this relationship?
yeah,
Because I think young people feel very much like, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to force things. I don't want to pressure someone. I don't want to feel needy. So they're not even going to even ask for what they want or even ask
yeah.
themselves, what do I want out of this relationship? They just go, I'll either take what I can get, or because I don't want to give up the attachment, or I'll see where it goes, or I'm cool, I don't need to, like all of those ambivalences about being vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah. I want to offer up what have you ever met or talked to Alexandra Solomon at Northwestern?
Oh, Alexandra, I just saw her last month,
Oh,
actually.
she's so wonderful. She gave some really good advice when I interviewed her for this book about situationships and which is to help the young person in your life think about where they're at in their body in the
Mhm.
situationship. And I don't just mean like whether they get off in the sex. I
Oh,
mean like when you know you're going to see the person, how do you feel before? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel stressed out because you don't know what's going on with the person, or the dynamic is feels so impoverished for you? And then there's how do or do you feel like excited? Okay, I get to see this person. I know it's not a committed relationship, but I really enjoy and I can be very present in the evening that we've planned together. So that's a big signal, right? So if you're excited, fine, nothing, that's not such a big deal. And then ask them to think about during. How do they feel during? What's happening like in their body during the time they're together? And then again after. Do they leave feeling like, oh, that was really nice? I don't know what's next, but it's not a big deal. I had a great time. Or do they just feel like gutted and sad? And that is real data. That is real data that is very hard if a young person is willing to engage with you about those issues, which not every young person will, but it's really hard to ignore. So even a parent who simply asks the questions will mean that the young person will ask themselves those questions and really assess and know, actually, in my body, I am not okay with this. This is not fulfilling my needs, even though I feel I really want this. And that kind of gut check that's a lifelong skill.
exactly, exactly. And we take it one step further. So what Alexandra is talking about and what sex therapists like myself and my colleagues do is it's called somatic therapy,
Oh,
right?
that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we're doing is we go further because a lot of people don't even have the ability to put emotional words to a somatic experience. So the car, what are you feeling in your body in general when you know you're about to have a date with someone? What do you feel in your body when you're engaging sexually or erotically with this person, whether it's online or in person? Do you feel your chest tighten? Do you feel your stomach feeling butterflies, or is there a pit in your stomach or a hole in your gut, right? Is there tension, right? Those are things that are sensations, hmm? But they may not have names for them yet because they're young people and
Yeah.
maybe also not as attuned to their body. And certainly for people, I would say, who have maybe disordered eating or eating disorders, who have had some trauma already in their lives, who may disassociate, being able to just talk about sensations and see if they're having them uh, is like a first step. And I actually think parents can have those conversations earlier on, early on in childhood, around what does your body feel like when you know you're going to go to the ice cream store? You know what I mean? Like, we're gonna go.
Yeah, you're so right. I love how that's a thought I'm really going to carry forward as I enter into the world of publicizing this book, is that it's a language that isn't always going to be right there. And it's something you want to cultivate. It's something that people may need to work on in therapy, of what it means to be in touch with your body that way. And a great skill for parents to bring on board as soon as possible. How do you feel in your body? Yeah.
Now, as part of being a sex therapist, one of the things we do is we do what's called a sexual history. And what we'll do is go through, because we think your sex education actually begins as a child through osmosis, watching the people around you, around how are they relating to one another, how are they touching, how are they speaking to one another, how do they express affection, how do they express love, right? And then going through first crushes,
Mm.
first initial fantasy, first initial, you know, you know, 5-year-old, like, I'm curious about people who don't have the same genitalia as me, right? All the way through to first crushes, first relationships, first whatever their experience has been. And, one of the things that I think you write so well about here, is you're asking people about, sex and first experiences of sex. And I think, you know, we still have, I'm going to go into kind of the patriarchy here. We still have what Lori Mintz has called, the orgasm gap, where in heterosexual relationships, women do not achieve orgasms as frequently as men do, and men go into a sexual scenario expecting to have an orgasm. And so I guess one of the things I would love to talk to you about is how parents can really, prepare kids for sexuality all the way through, not just penetrative sex, right?
Yeah.
But, what to expect and how to ask for something that they may not know what's coming, right? Like, how do you, so there's a two-pronged question. One is how to prepare kids to think about what they are interested in having in a sexual encounter. And the second one is how do you prepare someone to ask for something that they've never had before?
Yeah, I will have to I hope I don't disappoint you. I don't actually go into that precise thing in the book, because I made this decision that this was going to be a book that put the emotional landscape first. I'm a very big fan of Peggy Orenstein, and she really covers these issues of like assessing and finding language for the difficulties of finding language for what you want and navigating what you want in teen sex and relationships. There are a couple things I could offer to bring the perspective of my book to bear on this question that may be helpful to this question. Um, so one of the things that parents get really concerned about is um, relationship policy. Like, what do I do? And this is assuming that these parents know the value of the talk and hopefully know the value of the things that you're talking about, which is to figure out what you want. And these conversations, I think the book does cover in terms of like the importance of expressing those things to feeling like you're to preventing yourself from sexual abuse or violation or non-consensual sex. Um, but I think there some interesting conundrums come up because we have to figure out like what kind of space is okay in our homes for our children to explore their sexuality. And as I'm sure you know, sex educators always start with values. That what you say about the policy reflects your values in the household. So parents who come from a religious or ethnic tradition where the lines are really clear are just like, nope, open doors in the house, no sleepovers, you know, we don't want, this is not a sanctioned activity, right? So they're clear about their values. There are some issues with that, of course, that the young people will express. It's like it was really hard not to have a space to even talk about it because the fact that it could go on is essentially erased by that, which is very difficult. When you're a parent who is acknowledging that children, teens are going to be sexual, you have to make that judgment call as well and figuring out like, all right, at what age and stage is it open doors only or public spaces only? At what age is the closed bedroom door okay? At what age is the sleepover okay? If it's ever going to be okay. And I think when I got to those questions in my own life, I was really fascinated by things that I felt okay about and things I didn't. So things like I got a lot of the arguments for things like the sleepover or changing a policy to be more tolerant as a child gets older. But then a young woman I interviewed for the book basically let me know that she asked her parents to go out to dinner when she's just having a date, not like a boy, not a serious relationship, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, because she's bisexual. But she would basically say, like, Mom and Dad, could you please go out to dinner? I'm going to have this guy over. Basically, like, will you give me privacy to have sex? And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is so, and the parents were totally, this is how they wanted to roll. And I was like, wow, this is so great, but I can't do that. I just can't do it. Like, I can't be that open. And I felt really confused about that. And I struggled to express it in our family policy. And then I finally kind of figured out a language, which is that I really wanted my daughter to be aware of pleasure inequality, to, we have talked about it in a limited way. She often was like, no, mom, no, I know about that conversation over, but at least we got it out there, right? So we both know it matters to us. But then that whole thing of like really being open about giving your kids space to truly explore, which especially girls in heterosexual relationships need for the reasons you talk about. The boy orgasm is automatic, the girl orgasm is an art form, right? At least for some girls, right? And art takes time, it takes privacy, it takes being relaxed, it takes all this stuff. And so I sort of struggled with feeling a little bit like a hypocrite for this until I finally said, you know what, I want you to know that I both value this and I really value the privacy around this. So I think I figured out a kind of unspoken way to, it wasn't quite as explicit, but my husband and I just started to leave more open spaces, knowing they were open spaces, allowing them to happen when she got older as opposed to when she was younger. And we felt like it wasn't, the situation wasn't ready for that yet. So I hope that helps in answering the question.
I think it's a good response because I think we talk about values and
Yeah.
priority our clients as well. And I think that for more traditional or religiously strict, adhering families, there it's no question and it's no discussion.
Yeah.
And but I've also seen, people who tell me about their histories who they weren't allowed to date. It was never a question. They weren't allowed even to go to, this was a, client who was raised Muslim in the States. No, she wasn't allowed to go even for sleepovers with other girls. Like, so
Yep.
she knew that she wasn't even allowed to have crushes. And later on, she figured out a way to secretly date. And, so in order to be able to learn about herself. But I also think it's helpful to encourage girls to, one of the things you miss there is practice. It's an art form, but it takes practice.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that to include that in the, sort of series of talks. And if your kid isn't going to talk to you, because I was there myself, to give really good resources
Yeah.
to to address. And there are some great sites like the one
Scarletine.
Scarletine
Yeah.
and Heather Corinna's site, and
Yep.
also the one at Columbia is Ask Alice, I think. And
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
yeah,
and I actually think if your kid is a reader, and even if they're not, Peggy Orenstein's Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex are just fabulous books because they're not just about the expressions and the expression of desire and of navigating sexuality, but they're also about the social context. And I think that's really powerful for kids to talk about, and they're interested in talking about it quite often. And I don't think it's just a gendered thing. Like I think boys often, even though they're dealing with a different set of expectations, when they're given the space to talk about this stuff, they often take it with like great relief. Like finally, someone's engaging with me on this stuff. So yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
One of the things that you cited this, where is it? Trying to find where the question is because there was a study that I hadn't been aware of. Um, yeah, the study by Lawrence Steinberg's Families at
Oh
Adolescence,
yeah.
showing that 40% of parents go through what we would be calling an emotional midlife crisis when their kids become adolescents, whether the parents are in their late 30s or they're in their 50s. And, I've worked with clients who project their own teenage mistakes, anxiously worrying that their kids might repeat their painful experiences. They kind of try to control their teens' behaviors by setting these stringent rules around curfew times or how often the kid is allowed to see their partner. So, what did you find when interviewing parents about what emotions got raised as they witnessed their kids' emerging romantic lives?
Um, that's such a great question. I a friend of mine read an early version of this book, and her comment was, "We're all still recovering from being teens." And I quote her all the time. That quote got it. I put it into the next draft of the book, and it's still there. And I think it's so true. So yes, parents get very stirred up by watching their kids enter the teen years, because it brings up a lot. It's like they get to have all the firsts again. They hopefully get to do it better than we did, right? Um, and and it just stirs up regret, longing for different lives, um, nostalgia, all kinds of things. I think men go through, fathers go through at once a drop in self-esteem watching their kids date, or actually no, they get more sorry, they get fathers get depressed watching their sons date, but they also have a rise in self-esteem. That was like a wacky finding from that study. And it's almost like what their sons are doing out in the world sexually is some reflection on the fathers, where the mothers tend to have these feelings of, regret and longing and should I change my life and things like that. So it does stir up a lot. And so I think that what I have heard from parents is a lot of, I don't want my daughter, son, child to turn out like I did or to go through what I did. So if they had experienced sexual assault, dating abuse, domestic abuse, anything traumatic, they felt very concerned about what would happen to their child. And sometimes that really opened them up in really a very beautiful and inspiring way. And then sometimes it shut them down where there are things they literally couldn't see because they were still sort of in their stuff, being self-protective, not wanting to believe certain things could happen to their child. Um, so one of the big messages in my book is for parents to take that time to really tune in to what they're going through and not impose it on their child. Their child at this juncture really needs to be seen and heard for what they are going through at the moment. And so children are often very curious about their parents' past romantic lives, and it's not like you can never bring that up. They're really powerful, lasting cautionary tales that teens will quote to me. I remember mom telling me about her bad boyfriend or what have you. But the timing of this disclosure is really important. If your child is in strife about a breakup, for example, this is not the time to go into your worst breakup when you were 15.
Timing is everything.
Timing is everything. So it's just really about when you bring these things into the conversation. That's really important. And then to just know you're going to need care for yourself if it really stirs up a lot. And yeah, it's like you want to try to find that balance between acknowledging some of the reasons for the ways you react and the policies you set and giving your children their own reality in this journey. And that has been something that parents really were glad to have a space to talk about when I interviewed them. And I think that it actually opened up a lot in their family life because in a couple of cases, I interviewed the child, I interviewed the parents, and then I went and spent time with them and was actually privy to their conversations about certain difficult subjects. And the act of having a journalist come and ask them all about these things that no one talks about allowed them to have, I don't take full credit, but it opened up a space for them to start to connect on a deeper level about what they were going through intergenerationally and not just like one person's past and one person's present.
So it's interesting because I think it's helpful to talk about these things before it happens.
Yes.
Before they actually have this kind of feeling of being in love or crush. And it just made me think about, I'm originally from Toronto, and my first love was like, just, I mean, all encompassing. And that first heartbreak was horrible. It took a long time to get over, but then we became friends. And to this day, I was in Toronto just a month ago, and I happened to run into him, you know?
Mhm.
And I was so happy to see him, you know, and
That's
so I'd
great.
be able to talk. I did talk to my kids about that because
Yeah.
it you know, a defining moment for me. It was crushing when when the breakup happened. But I felt so lucky that I even had this loving relationship that lasted a year. You know what I mean? Like, so being able to sort of talk about it in kind of this way before they start dating, they, as you said, they listen, they hold on to these stories and they go, oh, that can happen. You can still actually have a loving relationship, even have a heartbreak that you feel horrible about, and then you can go move on, right? Um,
Yeah.
another thing I thought was, which is I did with my kids, because I had mental illness in my family of origin,
Hmm.
is I actually talked very openly about mental illness and
Yeah.
about diagnoses and specific
Hmm.
symptoms. I mean, they know I'm a therapist. But I also said to them, you know, many of these uh, disorders start to emerge in young adulthood, including teen years.
Yeah.
And so it's a really important thing to address and let me know if you're starting to feel them yourself or you notice them. And, or if one of your close friends you see start developing some of these symptoms. And I
Yeah.
always want you to feel like you can come to me no matter what. And I think you do talk about that in the book, which is great. But the idea of mental health,
Yeah.
which so many young people are going through, and I think younger people are more aware of the words even and they may not be aware of how to notice symptoms and how to address it when they're in a relationship, either for themselves or with someone else.
Oh, that's such a good point. I think you're absolutely right. I'll share that when I started reporting this book, it was during the pandemic, and I was asking people to talk to me over Zoom, and there would be because no one had anything else to do, we would have these long conversations where they'd go over everything, and I would really get different first love experiences and first relationship experiences. And after a while, I was like, what's going on here? Every relationship story seems to entail one partner or both having some kind of breakdown, or dealing with depression, being hospitalized, being in crisis. And at first, I started looking for stories that didn't involve these things. And then I realized that every teen love story is also a mental health story. And just to deal with it where it was at, because this generation is distinctly troubled from the way that we're measuring it right now. The rates of depression and anxiety are not good. But it's also a
So much
very
higher,
mental
right?
health. Sorry,
They're so much higher.
it's so much higher. Their mental health literacy is also very high. They talk about mental health. They have language. I one day I said to my class, it's like, you guys know each other's diagnoses, right? This, all your friends, you know who they are, what they like to do for fun, and you know what meds they're on and what their diagnosis is. And they are all like, yep, yep, yep. And so they are bringing this into their relationships. And what makes this so complicated, I mean, first of all, there's no reason, unless there is a reason, right? A personal reason not to have a relationship. Even if you're dealing with anxiety and depression, that relationship is not a pill. It's not a cure-all. That's a conversation that needs to be ongoing in any household. But there's nothing that disqualifies you. And some young people really do feel that way. But then there's this other complicating factor, which is that because inherent in the emotions and, as we discussed before, addictive nature of romantic desire and mutual love, that means that it relationships themselves will by default entail anxiety, entail feeling unwell, whether it's when you're wondering whether your crush is going to like you back, or if you started making out with someone, initiated a relationship and that didn't work out, or you're dealing with just the ups and downs of figuring out the challenges of a mutual relationship. And so sometimes young people will conflate being mentally ill, being truly disordered, with the significant emotional challenges of being in a relationship. And those two things can meld and overlap and all of those other things. But I think it's also really important, along with supporting mental health literacy, is to say, like, this is the world. When you know you're going to take a test or write a paper in school, you get anxious because that is what spurs you to get something done. And so when you feel someone in your life is not as loving to you as you are to them, even if it's just for that day or forever, you're going to get the feels. You're going to feel sad. You're going to feel unwell. You're going to feel pain. And that is all part of the human design. And it does not necessarily mean that you are broken. It actually can often mean that you are whole, you know?
I
Like,
love that example though of the
yeah.
test,
Yeah.
because what you want to say, right, is also there's a certain balance of anxiety that you do want to have, right,
Yes.
when you do a test, because it does kind of keep you energized and engaged and present. When there's too much anxiety, right, it actually impacts your ability to function well. And I think in some ways that's a great corollary for being in love. Like if it goes over too much into like, obsessiveness and not being able to concentrate and focus and still do the things that you like to do or your goals are, like that is a place of concern.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that, it's all these things are very fine lines. But we do always want to allow room for normative responses of anxiety, grief, and pain, and then to kind of just still stay in touch with what needs additional attention.
Right. You know, as I said, we do these, sexual histories with all of our clients who come in for sex therapy. And, we frequently hear stories in which the details of a client's sexual behavior and or emotions regarding a person they loved was leaked to a much larger community of people through social media.
God.
Can you talk about what you learned in your research for this book? We know it's a frequent thing now with younger generations than ours, how social media impacts teens, the meanings, and then the reluctance they may have around expressing emotional vulnerability in these new relationships.
Yeah, I say all the time that if I had to grow up with the technology that young people grow up with, where nothing is ever over, nothing is ever away, nothing is ever unseen. At the end of the school day, my crush did not come home with me, right? My crush was in math class, and I didn't see him until the next math class. Now the kids have the crush in their pocket all the time to gaze upon the pictures, see what he's doing, who he's dating, what have you. And that's really painful. And whenever I think about it, I just kind of die inside. Like, how do these kids do it, right? And then what you're talking about in terms of the how people can suffer when something very private is shared. Um, I do think that young people today can still be victimized by this, by their images, and their emotional sharing being exposed to a wider audience, shall we say. Um, and that can be just an awful, awful thing. But I do sense, um, in my students, in my conversations with my daughter, a guardedness that, for example, people who are now coming into your office as adults, they were in that wave of social media and smartphone users where they did not see this coming. They did not have, their parents didn't know enough about it to warn them about this stuff. So I do feel like their parenting does include a lot of technology discussion and management in an ideal way. Um, so I think that a very powerful way of moving into this is to help young people see from the beginning of their digital lives, which now are starting really early, the power structures behind this stuff. Like that they're not just messaging a friend. They are sharing data with big tech, and big tech is making billions off of it. And especially for socially aware teens, this is a big deal. Like this gives them a little fire to like resist and do things that are more private. And it's not happening enough. Young people are still just horribly vulnerable to this stuff. But those kinds of conversations that are meta about things that really are the water they swim in, it's helping them see outside the fish tank. There is something outside the fish tank. And I think that is very, very powerful. And the other thing I'll add to this is that technology is really so difficult when young people are dealing with romantic rejection. In my classes, I always teach about Helen Fisher and her team and their brain scans. So it's like famous brain scans of people who just broke up, but they were still in love with the person who rejected them. And what they do is they take them, into the lab with the fMRI machine, and to get them to feel the feelings, they show that they flashed pictures of the ex in front of them, and people would cry and scream and weep, and it was like lots of drama. They were just thrust right back into the vividness of this breakup through the images. And I'll talk to my students about this. I'll show them a couple of things about the study, and I'll say, what does that remind you of? What everybody went through in that fMRI machine? And they'll be this kind of like, what is she talking about? I've never been in an fMRI machine. And then I'll take out, I'll mime holding the phone and scrolling. And I'll be like, this is your daily reality. After a breakup, you see image after image anytime you want of your ex, and anytime you don't want on social media. Your ex hiking a mountain, your ex was someone new, living their best life, like all those things. And that's exactly what thrust those people in the brain scan study back into their feelings and their distress. And that's what young people put themselves through every single day.
Right.
So I always talk about, even though young people will push back because they feel it's rude, the social media breakup, that to mute, unfriend, and all those things is an act of self-saving and not an admission of like anything else,
Self-care.
Yeah,
It's
they feel like they feel like it's rude. They feel like they're giving in. They feel like they're not tough enough. And I'll be like, look, we're just engineered to feel these feelings when we're reminded of our ex. So can you please like understand that you are already in torment? So this is not helping you at all. And I really strongly called me old fashioned, but this is one of the biggest takeaways for breakup advice is just unplug from this person as much as humanly possible. And even then it won't be enough. They'll show up in someone else's feed or whatever. So
Well, I think there's this part of breaking up and recovering from a breakup is this feel notion of who's winning and who's losing in love.
yes.
Part of the education you can offer young people is, or older people. I've seen older people going through breakups and
Yeah.
divorce and separations, is this is not about winning. This is
No.
about engaging deeply within yourself so that you can thrive again. And you will thrive again. And part of taking care of that is taking away the things that are causing you triggers, are triggering you. And using that
Exactly.
emotional, psychiatric, psychological language of triggering can be very, I think, resonant for young people as well, because they know that word.
Yeah.
Um, so, there's a
And if I could just add, like, why is caring more mean you lose, right? I mean, we know we have the emotional loss, but in terms of society, like the person with the bigger heart is, to me, that's I don't know, I can't say better or worse, but like we want to honor that, right? Instead of seeing it as you're the one who lost. I just find that so painful. It's like, give yourself some credit for having a heart and caring.
And this is part of having a heart, right? Go
Yes.
back to the Wizard of Oz, without the heart is meant to be broken. That's what happens. If it's better to have a heart broken than never having loved at all, right? Um,
Yep.
so, last thing I want to talk about, I guess, is the idea of you have some very painful narrative stories in the book around grooming, around
Yeah.
coercion, around young people not understanding how to set boundaries for themselves. Um, but I noticed you also, quoted your friend Esther Perel, who's my colleague as well. We came up together in the world of family therapy
Oh,
around
that's great.
the idea that, for young people, this idea of boundaries have become so black and white and limiting about looking at it from a power, again, back to power, that for my question is really like, what happened to flirting? What happened to Esther has always talked about like what happened to seduction, and
Yeah.
all the best romances in the world. Like, are we all you're going to politicize all of those? Well, that's part of the heart, right? And that's part
Yeah.
of being in love or falling in love. And so I think there's this question of like this notion of how do you educate young people to discern the difference between banter, flirting, understanding there's another person on the other side of the bridge, as I like to put it, who has feelings and interests and style that might be different than yours, versus coercion, power play, player. Like, so I thought that was an interesting sort of take here.
Yeah, it's tough. It's actually I constant my daughter, I'm very proud to say she's a junior in college and she works for her college's Title IX office. She's a consent educator. So
Boy.
when students come in for their first year and then they do a refresher later, they have their consent education be peer led. And so she's doing that. So we're talking about this stuff all the time. And she is awakening me to new things all the time. But it's also, I think I ponder those things too. She will talk about pressure, sort of repeated bids for someone's attention or sex or what have you, as a very negative thing when it's also true that sometimes there is a real erotic dance in persuasion that when people our age get together, we sort of go, oh, I guess young people aren't into that anymore. Um, so I think that I don't know if I can give an easy answer to the line between persuasion and pressure, between like erotic tension and manipulative seduction. Um, Except to say that when flirting is done well, it is very attuned, right? It's very much about what you try, what the other person, you know,
Respond to.
responds to, and that being in dialogue with Esther has been really important during this book because she is all about our relational selves. And that if we get too consumed with, this is my boundary, and if you cross it, you are wrong and should be canceled, we are forgetting that there's another person on the side of the boundary and what is in their humanity. Now, of course, sometimes you need to not connect with the person on the other side of the boundary and things aren't going well and you don't want to be with this person and it's clear. But then you also want to allow for a space of discovery, of journey, of the fact that sometimes in sexuality and desire, yes and no are not clear, and that to create spaces to find clarity and to figure out how to pursue is a very different thing than pressuring and ignoring like the subjectivity and agency of the person on the other side of the boundary. So I think we are in maybe a phase of corrective, with all this talk about canceling and consent and all this stuff. And
You.
that corrective is so important, that if we are raising our young people to be really in touch with their desires and what they want and what they don't want, that is a win. But then we work on also seeing what happens to sort of get back some mystery, some eros, some of all that stuff in a way that is not violating and is enlivening. And that comes from just really focusing on, that beauty of what it means to see someone else and hear someone else, which is endlessly enlivening in life, whether it's in a friendship or a conversation or a romantic relationship.
Yeah. I would, and I think this is great. And I also think I would add, like, it's also tone. And sometimes when you're messaging, you don't have the, obviously you don't have the tone. And so
Yeah.
able to ask someone, can I ask you something? And in kind of a really open, playful way, which is kind of flirtatious. What did you mean by that when you sent that text, or when um, you made that, request? Because I wasn't completely clear. And then the person has to actually like explain themselves. Uh,
Yeah.
and then the person can then set a boundary like, oh, that's so nice that you thought of that. I don't think I'm there yet. Here's what I would like. How are you with that? And that kind of being able to navigate a conversation without having to read minds, and without blocking someone, without understanding, I think that's kind of really helpful. And it's not about power, it's about engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, and frankness. And I think I've always found frankness pretty sexy, right? Or at least it's real, right? Even it's not something that turns you on because of the person isn't their frankness isn't the frankness you want. There's still just something really great about like, okay, let's just put aside the bullshit and speak frankly about what's going on here. That is can be a really enlivening gateway to closeness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much. There's so many other topics in this
I
book
know, but
to
this
get
is,
to, but we have a time limit.
but you were so thorough and you picked up on really important things. And I'm really grateful to be in conversation with you.
Here. Thank you so much for making the time. And the
Thank
book
you.
then is
First Love, Guiding Teens Through Relationships and Heartbreak.
right, and it's going to be out February
February 4. Yeah. Yeah.
February 4th.
February. All you have to remember is February.
February. Okay.